Well, welcome back, and first of all I'd like to thank the organisers, Louise, Daniel and all the team here that so kindly invited me to join this very important forum. I'm actually particularly happy to be here this afternoon because, surprisingly as this might sound, it doesn't really happen all the time to me. Even though I work on East Asia and East Asian security issues on a regular basis, it doesn't happen to me all the time to interact with Europeans and other Europeans in particular in terms of East Asian security. I tend to interact with Americans, North Americans and people in East Asia. And so it was indeed something that I was looking forward to have an opportunity to take a little bit of time to think about this question of how Europe and East Asia come close together, can come close together, where do sort of intersect with each other. And what I thought to do, though, was to do it in a way that it was slightly, you know, as an academic, as a proper academic, I always try to turn things the way I like them. So rather than comment on the broader relationship, I decided to focus in particular on the question of maritime strategy and maritime security. And when I started thinking about it as I was working on this lecture, my master's year sort of period came back to my mind. In particular, I remember then some years ago when I was in London as a young MA student coming from the continent, I always was feeling a little bit sort of troubled by the fact that I was not a native speaker. Particularly in class, I was always feeling like I need to be twice as much concentrated as my colleagues. So one day, and I was kind of jealous of other native speakers, you know, especially North Americans coming to Europe, and for them, to my mind, it was so easy, right? Because they speak the same language. Until one afternoon, after class, we were in a pub with some of the friends. I was talking to one of my British colleagues, who looked at me and told me, you know, I'm feeling a little bit stressed about the language, you know, you know, you know, we're not Canadians, we're not Americans. And he looks at me a little bit puzzled. It's like, oh yes, the dear cousins. Well, that's true, although, you know, they do speak a foreign language themselves. And it kind of like struck me, and it stayed with me. And as I was preparing this lecture, when I thought about maritime strategy and maritime security, and then I put Europe and East Asia in the same sentence, I thought, well, if it's not speaking different languages, it certainly is looking at different grammars. The grammar of maritime strategy, as I think it is conceptualized in Europe, is somewhat different from the one that is being conceptualized and certainly practiced in East Asia. And how will I explain this? Basically, I will try to go through four main points. When we talk about maritime strategy, of course, the question is, the sea becomes the center of the attention. We have to put the sea at the center, right? And we have to do that because it is only by shifting the focus, the attention, and putting the sea at the center of the action, then we understand why and how far the sea matter to a group of nation-state actors. And I'll look at it, first of all, from the perspective of what is the meaning of the sea in general, right? Before we get into the strategic, because we can only understand the strategic dimension if we see, first of all, if we have a little bit of thinking about the connection between the sea in broader sense and land. After all, we all live on dry land, right? So the importance of the sea to human beings can only be understood in relation to how it contributes to sustain, protect, advance life on land. And I have two elements there. Since we are in Europe, I thought to bring a bit of a European twist to understanding the role of the sea and how sort of nation-states relate to it in a broader sense, what I call the so-called the Brodelian understanding of the sea, drawing upon Fernand Brauddel's historical writings, first on the Mediterranean, but later on in his career also in relation to the broader maritime realms in East Asia. Before then sort of jumping into the strategic dimension, right? What does this use? The different uses that the sea offers to state actors engaging with it, how does that translate into issues of national security and requires the development of relevant maritime strategies. And then I will sort of highlight some of the differences in the way, in a broader sense, and there will be some oversimplification. So I do apologize for the oversimplification, but if you want to go more deeply into the specific or some of the national dimension of the discussion we're having here, by all means, if you want to talk more about the Japanese strategy or Chinese strategy, absolutely not a problem at all. But here, what I'll try to highlight are some fundamental dividing lines that exist in terms of construct. And sort of supplement the discussion about the different grammars with some of the examples. Because of reasons of time, I will focus in terms of examples that look at East Asia, mostly because I assume that being in Brussels, it would probably make more sense to talk about what is happening in East Asia, why it should matter to us at all, before drawing some general conclusion. So if we start off with a very basic idea, what is the sea, right? What is the sea in human civilization? That's a very fundamental question that surprisingly very few had asked until the 1960s, really in the 20th century, in a slightly more systematic fashion. And Fernand Braudel was one of the first historians, modern historians, to actually think about the sea as the center of the action rather than a place whereby people just travel by. But why we're coming at that so late? Because first and foremost, the sea represented always a way to separate different sort of entities, right? This is true in sort of European tradition as much as it is true in East Asia. Think about it, right? Until the end of the 17th century, encounters between Korea, Japan, China, it always happen. They are more the exception than the rule, right? We can count on the point of fingers of a couple of hands the number of times state actors from the different corners of Asia they tried to sort of cross the masses of the water. In more recent times, neo-realist scholars like Wertheimer called it the stopping power of the sea, right? So if mastering and sort of winning this stopping power takes a degree of skill, knowledge, technology, the ability to sail across expanses. And in a way, the ability to engage with that, the opposite, the ability to engage with the maritime realm, the ability to project a degree of power at sea, allowed the sea to develop also the opposite function. Turns out, there's very few places we cannot access from the sea. So not only, on the one hand, the sea represented, for a good deal of history, a primary tool that separated realities, political, social, national entities. But when someone actually endeavored to engage with it, it also represented a primary tool for communication and maneuver. Even today, almost 90% of the people that live in the world, they are never more distant than 200 kilometers from any coastal areas. Right? That's a powerful sort of connecting tool. But there is also another application, which I will get to in a moment. What does all of this mean, particularly sort of if we fast forward to the present? Well, if you look at this map, you have a clear sense of what I've been talking about when I was mentioning this element of space for communication and connectivity, right? The colored, the sort of the more intense the line gets, so the more red the line gets, the more intense the traffic at sea is. 90% of what we trade globally on the planet, whether it is by volume or by value, travels at sea. At any given point in time, there is a number of sort of millions and millions of containers that are traversing the sea. And that is true both for Europe as well as for East Asia. Let me give you a couple of data, macro data, as it were, to get a sense. 8 of the top 10 world megaports are located east of Singapore. And these are statistics that change every year, but roughly, when it comes to the top position and the top 4 or 5 position, really, it's a sort of like, you know, sort of finish line type of competition between Shanghai, Singapore, and then really, most of them are in Northeast Asia. I mean, really, right? Last year in 2012, the port of Singapore, which over the past couple of years was ahead of Shanghai. Sorry, we don't win it all, and we don't win it all the time. Sorry, but you know the port of Singapore, Shanghai was handling a little more than 30 million TEUs. So that's the standard measurement for containers. And to give you a sense in comparative terms, Rotterdam, which is the first European port in that category, handled in the same year about a third of what Shanghai did in its own terms. Now you must understand that Hong Kong is calculated separate from the rest of China, right? Then you've got other ports like Ningbo, like Tianjin, Qingdao, and then you have Busan. I understand many of you are from Korea. I was in Busan, it's beautiful. I mean, anyone from Busan? Really nice. I loved it, right? And I'm a maritime historian of East Asia, so you know, Busan is one of those places that is there, is at the center of a network of connectivity for many, many centuries. And even today, you can breathe that when you're there. And interestingly enough, there is lots of Chinese ports which would suggest that there is a lot of containers going around China. That is true, but those data have to be adjusted to the fact that Chinese ports are relatively new, so they do have the latest technologies in terms of handling containers. What is surprising is countries like Japan, and to a lesser degree, to a lesser extent Taiwan, they don't feature in that top 20, right? The first is like Osaka, and then you've got Nagoya. They are further down the list. That doesn't mean, however, that for these countries the use of the sea is less critical and vital. 97% of Japanese trade by volume and value travels at sea. Simple fact is just they handle less. And some of the Chinese ports in the region are operating as rerouting places for intra-regional traffic. Now, if you look at the data from the European Union, similarly, it's quite interesting. 90% of our trade going out travels at sea. 40% of the internal trade within the EU is also moved at sea, at least according to the European Maritime Strategy document. So, you know, if you disagree with the data, don't pin it down on me, right? But also, what is increasingly important in Europe, and it's always been there, and it is also very important in East Asia, is the use of the sea as a resource in itself. Fisheries. Proteins coming from fish stocks is very, very important. We are one of the largest producers and consumers in Europe of fish, and in East Asia, 35% of the average annual protein intakes actually comes from fish stocks. Of course, there is another dimension of the sea as a resource that is connected to oil, gas, so natural resources present in the seabed. So combined all together, right, when we think about when we started, and we started looking at the sea no longer just as a means to separate us, but also as a massive platform for communication, you have three functions that emerged quite prominently. As a platform for promoting trade and commerce, right, as a source and a provider of living resources, fish, and also as a provider of non-living resources, gas, oil. How does it all translate in terms of the importance of these functions to regional security from a perspective of different national state actors? Well, usually, from a national sort of point of view, the strategic dimension or the strategic implications of the importance of the sea for national security come down into three main sort of brackets or areas, right? As a means of communication, so in relation to this function of trade and commerce, in the strategic dimension in national security, this is when states talk about the importance of sea lane defense or securing the sea lanes of communication. You talk about that in the case or when there is a genuine importance of trade and reliance upon the sea in that respect. Insofar as sort of the resource dimension is concerned, access, exploitation, management, they bring about a very familiar expression, right? Maritime security. This is about sort of bringing to bear capabilities to conduct policing functions to protect the maritime environment and have the possibility to monitor how the resources in this area are exploited. And the sort of third umbrella, right, that brings everything together, precisely because of what we can do from the sea, moving about, and at sea, because of access and control of resources, well, we have a third dimension, one that is much more, sort of, it's much broader, that of the projection of political influence. The sea as a platform to project states' power at sea and from the sea. Remember always, the question is about how the sea and land are connected together, right? So it is natural that one of the applications is connected to this ability to use the sea as a place from where we project state power, whether in war or in peacetime through diplomatic activities. What in military terms, in sort of strategic terms, you'd call the importance of either developing sea denial capabilities or sea control. Usually, sea control is the type of situation in which you have full access to a particular maritime space, you are fully in control for the majority of time, and certainly when it is required of you, and it allows you to use therefore that space, either to just have safety of transportation, the safety of the sea lanes, exploit the resources, or even project power if and when necessary. Based on this, what I call the sort of the Courbetian dimension, right? This is an understanding of maritime strategy that goes back not to maritime strategy as a place where you talk about big ships fighting each other, right? I've got a carrier, whoa, right? I've got the bigger gun than yours, yeah, right? That's one very small element of it. This is about the art of naval warfare. It is not maritime strategy. Maritime strategy is about connecting the various elements, the various facets of the importance of the sea to national security and developing strategies in which the use of the sea and the deployment of capabilities of sea will allow you to address these challenges. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have the bigger ship, right? You might find someone else who's got big, ships like yours, and you get together and then you become stronger than the other guy, right? Sort of the combination of different ways of approaching that. It's not a zero sum, it's not either positive or negative. It's about finding the proper balance between achieving a particular goal and the means available at your disposal. But that's where there is an additional dimension. In particular, there is one of these dimensions, the one that concerns maritime security, that I want to spend a little bit more time about, because this is perhaps one area where, when we talk about Europe and East Asia, there is a difference. And certainly I'm pretty confident about the fact that there are different grammars that are being used, whether you are sitting in Europe or you're sitting in East Asia. Conceptually speaking, maritime security looks at two different dimensions. The biggest elements to it are connected to two expressions of state control at sea. In particular, these have become particularly prominent in light of the establishment of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, which brought about stronger functional rights of state actors, of coastal states, and in a way made the situation at sea slightly more complicated, because until then the big idea was, up until 3 nautical miles is coastal waters, everything else is high seas. That's free for everyone, right? This goes back to the very origins of the Grotius sort of principle of freedom of navigation. What a beautiful expression, freedom of navigation. It's nice, isn't it? I know. That's what a real sailor is about. It's looking at the horizon, right? You don't see what's behind, and that's what attracts you to the sea, right? Which is the opposite of the fisherman, because the fisherman is always keeping an eye at the coastline. But I think the important point to take out of this is that UNCLOS brought about a slightly reconceptualization. In a way, it reinforced the fact that one must regulate how far state control can go at sea. So it reinforced the principle of the freedom of navigation. But at the same time, said, hang on a second. Hang on. Because the original principle of the 3 nautical miles was developed originally based on, even though it is slightly disputed, around about a very, very simple principle. It was called the cannon shot rule. Because when it settled down the 3 nautical miles, it was based on the fact that the longer guns, right, things like the 30-pounders, would reach out to roughly round about that distance. But in the so the 1970s and 1980s, in the run-up, the idea was, hang on, but there's lots of people that might not have the same type of technology. Particularly during the Cold War, the superpowers had started developing the technology to project their power at far greater distances than the 3 nautical miles. So what about the others? What if you don't have the capacity to actually protect yourself, right? And so UNCLOS came about to provide an answer, right? UNCLOS was the framework of the little guy, the Davids against Goliath, right? Who were the champions, those who really won it all at the end of the day, even though it's always a negotiating process. When you have like hundreds of people in a room, they always have to negotiate. But who were those who really got the day at the end of the process? States like African countries. Long coastlines, very little capacity, very little capabilities. So how do you, well, you've got a framework that empowers the state to have, well, 12 nautical miles as your own coastal waters. Everything else is still high seas. That's an important point. But coastal states have special rights, functional rights that allow them to access resources, to manage the environment, and to exploit it for the benefit of their development. But, so this is really, this dimension is encapsulated in this idea of boundary disputes, right? The post-UNCLOS world is a world whereby one dimension of interaction among states at sea revolved around this problem of how to settle boundaries, right, and finding ways to negotiate. Now, I will not go into the details of UNCLOS, but I'm happy to discuss it. And I think the key point to take away was that, on one hand, the discussion about the boundaries and this new dimension really was to reinforce and consolidate an already existing principle, the one of freedom of navigation and the one that concerned the freedom of overflights. UNCLOS did not bring about a territorialization, a full territorialization of the maritime space, right? The sea is not equal to the land in that sense. I was lucky enough half a year ago to attend a conference with one of the founding fathers of UNCLOS, one of the guys that came up with some of the principle. So I asked him, because there is a debate, particularly so there's Chinese scholars, some Chinese scholars that suggest that there are very conservative interpretations of UNCLOS that would allow a country in its exclusive economic Z, which is one of the expressions of these functional rights, to almost equal the sea to the land, right? When I asked him, it's like, what was it about when you guys were discussing? Like, no. The spirit of UNCLOS was not to undermine the freedom of navigation. It was actually to reinforce it by defining the limits and the boundaries of state action at sea. And again, here, I think the other point to take away is that boundary delimitations, because they are connected to the functional use of the sea, in particular for its economic exploitation, it isn't about a zero-sum type of game. There are a number of cases, a number of examples in international maritime practice where boundaries were settled, where countries voluntarily reduced the amount, the maximum they could have been given by UNCLOS in terms of their exclusive economic zone, and negotiated a different type of settlement with the country they were having sort of a dispute. The key point here being that it's about, because it's about functional access and use of the maritime space, it's about sharing resources. It's about getting a sense of where these resources are coming from and how we can draw benefit from them. Mind you, even in a situation like in the East China Sea, where part of the disputes between China and Japan is about the definition of maritime boundary, well, in 2008, the two governments, notwithstanding all the disagreements they might have on everything under the sun, they actually came together and they decided to have a consensus, right, around a particular area of one of the gas and oil fields in the East China Sea, which is within the disputed boundary. And they decided that they would probably sort of try to explore together that area and identify ways to sort of further develop jointly the economic advantages provided by this. There is another element that I'd say stands out and really it's always been there, and it's part of what states are all about, the defense of national territory. Now, guess what? At sea, because most of the time you cannot live on the sea, it's not that you draw a wall, right? You know, where East Germany and West Germany ended in Berlin. Well, you know, go and see the wall. Where does the boundary between China and Japan end at sea? Oh my God! How does it look? Blue, with nothing around it, right? Now that's an important point to make. And why is it an important point? It's an important point because at sea, the tiny, teeny island features that exist stand out more, right? There's a rock, it's mine, my precious, right? It's like, I want it. There's a piece of pottery left over from 1,000 years ago, that's mine. Okay. I mean, nobody has ever visited the eastern part of the Mediterranean, where between the Greeks and the Italians, oh my God, you know, if we go down that line, we're never going to come out of it, really. But there is an element there, because the land stand out much more. It's slightly different, the problem there. It's not about those relative games, it's not about the functional rights, right? The ability to ascertain, to make a statement about the national sovereign control of a particular island feature, it says something about who you are as a state and who you are in particular as a government. It says something about your ability to fulfill a primary mission that all governments have, and that is to protect the national boundaries. Ask Nigel Farage about it and he'll tell you his version of this story. Right? So in that case, it's not so much the law in itself that is important, but it's like history. Because how do you define what yours and what is not yours? Well, you present a narrative. That narrative has a particular political value to it and is mobilized to present a particular case. Most of the maritime territorial disputes aren't really about the law, right? They are about a particular interpretation of what that state actor power and status is. If you call the disputed islands of the East China Sea or the South China Sea, say, for example, let's assume the East China Sea, well, between Korea and Japan, if you call it Dokdo, it has a meaning. If you call it Takeshita, it has another meaning. If you call it Senkaku, it has a meaning. If you call them Galyu, it's got another meaning. And the story around it matters more than the piece of rock in itself. I'm pretty sure that the sheep that are living on the Senkaku Islands don't have an opinion about their nationality. They will keep eating, regardless, right? So here we've got two different elements. In particular, this dimension that concerns about the maritime security dimension of operating at sea and from the sea, today has this two dimension which are, I would say, the two extremes or the two extreme expressions of two forms of projection of power of the state at sea. One, the territorial sovereignty, it's absolute. And by the way, if you look at President Mao of Taiwan, his peace initiative for the East China Sea, the fundamentals of his peace initiative are exactly about that. It's like, well, you know, we can't talk about the sovereignty of the islands because we're never going to find an agreement about that. But let's talk about the ability to access in an advantageous way for everybody the areas that are in dispute for economic purposes. Because what happens if you don't have an agreement? You know, maritime security is usually considered and is conceptualized. Take any textbook on maritime strategy, and I teach it, so I kind of know them all. Any textbook about maritime security will start with one fundamental assumption, that whatever states are doing at sea starts off on a clearly identified sphere of control. If you are implementing maritime security there, it's because that's yours. But what if it isn't ascertained that it is yours? What if that little teeny tiny rock is in dispute? What if the boundary around it is in dispute? Although theoretically, the Japanese government does not acknowledge the existence of the dispute, so let me put it down as I tick that box, okay? So dispute does not exist, but there is a strong disagreement, right? We learned on the 7th of November that China and Japan agree that they disagree. That's good. That's really a clear sense of advancement. What if that maritime boundary and the way you project it and project your power and you want to enforce your rights in that contested space are not clarified? What if you are trying to deploy your coastal patrol cutters in an area that is not under your control, but you claim it is, and you're claiming that you're doing maritime security surveillance operations? What does that say about the concept of maritime security? Well, this, in a way, has something to do, and so conceptually speaking, where is the problem, and why this problem matters today, and why this problem matters, and I'm emphasizing it now, because I think it is very much consistent with the next part of the discussion, which is the difference between maritime strategy as it is conceptualized and understood in East Asia and in Europe. Well, if we think about forces operating at sea, and for the purpose of the discussion right now, I will keep air forces out of it. However, I'm happy to talk about it in the question time, because when they're operating at sea, they kind of like falls under similar sort of umbrella in terms of type of operations conducted. But in terms of maritime operation, maritime forces deployed at sea, well, maritime forces in general, they tend to have three different type of functions that they all combine together to a higher or to a lower degree. You've got sort of, at the fundamental level, navies in particular, they are designed for high end of the spectrum type of kinetic activities, right? Military action, the conduct of military operation. But while they're not fighting, they still can perform a diplomatic as well as a constabulary function. This is my 20-second enjoyment as a naval geek. So, what makes a ship different from any other piece of military hardware? I think in 20 years I will have run this thing a number of times that people will answer me automatically. If anything, just to shut me up. What's the big difference between a naval asset, a naval platform, and any other piece of military equipment? I mean, it floats. That's true. Right? That's true. What can you do on it that you can't do in a tank or on the back of air transport? Why navies do possess this element of diplomatic function that armies and air forces don't? If I deploy my forces along a border on land, I say, for example, I put a tank division, right? Or, as the Americans did a few months ago, they redeployed a part of their forces from Italy down to Poland. Interesting, right? Well, it kind of sends a strong message, right? But I can have a ship parked outside territorial waters of the country and then pull it in the port, right? Have a big party, and we're all happy about it. We can invite diplomats on board, right? A ship is a reproduction on scale of the society. It performs all functions of daily life. You live in it, you sleep in it, and you spend most of the time, right? So in that respect, it performs a number of functions that allows it to have a much greater value when it comes to diplomatic activity. I mean, to be honest, in all fairness, I've had students who had parties on the back of a people carrier tank. But honestly, it's just not as fun, It's really complicated. It's really sort of, Even air transport, apparently the C-130 Hercules, it's a very good place to have a party. But again, I will never trade it with the back of a ship with a helicopter hangar. You can have a blast, music going, pumping out loud, A couple of years ago, one of NATO mine warfare reaction force was visiting London, and they organised a party, and it was very funny because at the end of the evening, when all the diplomats and the senior people sort of moved out, the chief NCO of the destroyer where the party was held put the music out, and it was disco for, you know, the following 3 hours in the middle of London with the O2 on the back. It was really cool. So there is an element there. The maritime forces in general do perform these functions, multiple things at the same time. Obviously, coast guards, the law enforcement, these are very highly specialized type of maritime forces, right? Unlike navies, coast guard are developed in particular to perform law enforcement, those constabulary and to a degree these days also diplomatic functions. If you send them to a country that doesn't have a coast guard and you do a bit of capacity building, that's also part of sort of a diplomatic action, a broad diplomatic action. And my argument would be that, remember what I was saying earlier on about maritime security, how conceptually it starts off with the wrong premises, that everything is clear? Well, guess what? In East Asia, because things aren't clear, the guys with the white ship are deployed to do the nasty things, right? They are actually closer to that military dimension of the spectrum. Mind you, of course, you could say like, yes, true, but at the end of the day, a Coast Guard cutter or a patrol vessel has a water cannon. Yes. Now point a water cannon at a radio antenna communication. See what happens then. That's a clearly weaponized use of a non-particularly weapon-designed weapon, right? So there is an element there that, and I think it's particularly prominent in East Asia these days, whereby the forces that are designed to implement the enforcement activities, the protection of the environment, the management of the environment, are actually at the forefront of the crisis. Because they're not being used to just implement something that is clear on the ground, they're trying to be deployed to actually have a change of the status quo, as you were. To make a point about that is a contested area. My rights are just as good as yours. And I don't like you, and I'm going to shoot your antenna off your boat. That actually happens quite regularly, quite frequently. Go ask the Vietnamese. Yeah. Actually, even the Korean Coast Guard, actually, now that I think about it. Although these days the Korean Coast Guard is not in very sort of good position, but, you know, let's leave that for some other time. So, why are we saying there is two different grammars? If you go through the maritime strategy, the EU maritime strategy, and the joint communique that preceded it, in particular focusing on maritime security, in terms of maritime security interests and maritime security threats, it's interesting that it's reference to conflict prevention, but most of it really is about protecting infrastructure within the European context, preventing illegal immigration, preventing the protection of borders, the protection of the supply chain, and the prevention of illegal fishing. It is very much focused on those constabulary functions. When it comes to threats to it, it's interesting. A territorial dispute are identified in the joint communique, but the definition is slightly watered down, as it were, when it comes to maritime strategy, the final document. And everything else, proliferation, maritime piracy, terrorism, cross-border crimes, pollution, natural disasters, these are all sort of on the higher end of the spectrum, sort of diplomatic stroke constabulary. There is very little kinetic and there is very little understanding in the document that actually maritime security can be used as a tool, as an exercise of the use of force on behalf of state. Partly because in Europe and in the European context, this type of attitude is more the exception than the rule. Comes to my mind the good old days of Libya under Gaddafi, when if you were a Sicilian fisherman, going in the Gulf of Sirte was not really something that you want to do, because you might get shot at. And in fact, it's quite interesting, because in 2010, just a couple of weeks before the much more notorious event of the Chinese fisherman captain ramming the Japanese Coast Guard, a tiny little boat from Sicily going down to fish tunas in the Gulf of Sirte got back home with holes from a machine gun of the Libyan patrol boats. Nobody knew anything about it, and the Italian government made sure that it was not being used, because there is an understanding that if you go to the Gulf of Sirte, we're not going to come after you, right? We're not going to rescue. The other one, ramming a boat. Oh my God, the end of the world. So there is this element here that I think is extremely troubling intellectually, because we do not simply have the conceptual framework to allocate and understand how maritime security at the moment is becoming part of the problem. The way we conceptualize it, well, let's do maritime, let's focus on maritime security. That's fine, but in that part of the world whereby there is an abundance of disagreements as to where and how far state can apply their control, I think that becomes part of the issue. And you can see that when you compare in sort of, and I'm focusing here primarily on China or Japan, partly South Korea, and there are differences, so I'm happy to talk about the differences in the question time, but for the sake of time, I think when we look at the main maritime strategies in East Asia, what strikes you in the main documents as the wording and sort of the conceptual differences, I think there's three different levels. One, in general, the vocabulary. You will not find, you rarely find in European national strategy these days things like anti-submarine warfare, mine warfare, or sea control, sea denial, anti-access area denial. We only use them when we have to point out to someone else doing it. Oh, and by the way, in East Asia, there are countries that are pursuing anti-access area denial capabilities. Okay, what does that mean? We don't do that anymore? It's like, it's out of fashion. It's not really fashionable. Honestly, so uncool. Stop doing that, right? There is a second difference, which I think is also very, very important. The overall layout and the approach to maritime strategy is very different. Most of the European documents are certainly at the European level, and I understand that there might be a degree of negotiation in the European context, which makes sense, by the way, because nation states do still perform important sort of functions in terms of that kinetic projection. Still, it's quite interesting that there is a substantial difference in the way maritime strategies are presented in East Asia compared to a quick glance in the European context. As I said, the militarized use of constabulary capabilities, as well as the emphasis on the procurement of capabilities. You know, if you are in Japan, the word amphibious comes to mind quite often, and it comes across quite often, and it is considered as an important aspect. Maritime strategy in Japan, one of the big novelties of the past 4 years, focused on the procurement not only of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, which is a trend that is global sort of accepted nature, but in particular the attention to a degree of amphibious capabilities to provide for territorial defense. Right? I don't think any major European doctrine other than the British and to an extent the French one has references to amphibious operations in the classic traditional sense. You know, amphibious raids, you actually land people ashore. I was in Japan this summer, and I had the pleasure to visit the base where the first amphibious regiment it's been developed. And you do get a sense, I have familiarity with the Royal Marine Commanders, with the Italian Amphibious Force, with the US Marine Corps is slightly different, it stands on the ground of its own. But say, in comparison to some of the European expressions of it, there is a very different sort of mentality in terms of what the main driver for your mission when you look at these different forces. So the way strategy is set up, it's very different, whether it is for territorial defense, certainly less so for sort of national projection or outside of the context of national boundaries, but in the regional national context is going exactly the opposite way. It's not postmodern, it's very modern. It's very much about, this time around, it is about the big guns. Not only that, but of course, part of the lingo includes some similarities. Modern militaries are particularly expensive. They require a degree of interoperability, a degree of also connectivity and interconnection between the different services. So in East Asia as well, there is an enormous emphasis on how to make what you have more effective, more functional in that sense. In practical terms, why is this the case? Well, the practice of maritime strategy, particularly in East Asia, if we look at it, why there is this difference in terms of the conceptual layout and the structure and the vocabulary? Well, because if you look at the practice is not necessarily reassuring. By the way, I'm very positive. I'm generally speaking, I'm very positive. So if you had the impression that I've been negative, don't worry. There is a nice positive spin at the end of this story, okay? And it'll come across in the question time. I'm extremely positive, very positive person, right? Really optimistic. I'm Italian, right? I'm genetically designed to be nice and sort of cheerful. I can't be depressing. It's just, it doesn't go with the character. They take the gene out. So what I call, if you look at what is happening, particularly, for example, I'm using this as a case, but I'll come back to the South China Sea, which is the second very large maritime theatre in East Asia. But if you look at the East China Sea, what is happening at the moment in terms of the tensions over the definition of the maritime boundaries and the territorial disputes is what I would call very much a political projection, or a projection of political willingness at sea on behalf of the various state actors. In particular, the fact that the dispute over the territorial dispute has been prioritized in the national agendas highlighted the political dimension of this. And in particular, one country more than others, certainly in this case PRC, has been deploying what I call an iron fist in a white glove. The white glove being the white painted ships. Usually, the rule of thumb is, if it is white painted, these are the nice guys. That's the Coast Guard, they come and rescue. If it's grey painted, it's a Navy, you know, careful with that. Actually in East Asia, that's not really the case. If they're white painted, do, you know, pay attention, be careful. Hence this idea, this reverence of the white gloves. And of course, in addition to that, this idea of how this has been brought, not only this contestation, this confrontation is no longer applying by assets operating on the surface, it's been brought up also in the skies. And it does raise some interesting questions. Of course, here I'm referring to the introduction of the Chinese Air Defense Identification Zone last November 2013, a very controversial, not because it is an ADIZ, many countries have them. In fact, the United States has probably got the most extensive one. But it's not the fact that the ADIZ is the problem. It's how the package that comes with it, the measures that are introduced with it. That's the problem, that's the issue. That's why it's so different from others. And the second very troubling aspect of it, it's very much close to Chinese claims in terms of the EEZ in the East China Sea, which raises the tantalizing question as to whether the Chinese actually are applying an interpretation of the airspaces over the EEZ as fully under the same type of control of the EEZ. And if that's the case, does that mean that when they try to implement it, they're using a very conservative interpretation of the EEZ, one in which the rights of the freedom of navigation, right of overflight, or, for example, peacetime military conduct of peacetime military operations, military activities, is denied or requires the acceptance by the coastal state. What are the implications? I think when we're talking about Europe and East Asia, there are at least three different implications. One, the way at the moment the conflict over territorial maritime disputes is unfolding in East Asia, in the East China Sea, certainly this is the case, but it is also very similar in the South China Sea. It's a challenge to the international order. Now, all maritime strategists, Europeans, you know, part of the East Asian, they all pledge to follow the international order as it exists, in particular the concepts and the principles that support freedom of navigation as well as UNCLOS. Well, some of the behavior that at the moment has been sort of set forth, and there's a number of examples. We can talk about the examples in the question time. I'm happy for you to challenge me on this as well. I think it presents a substantial challenge to the international order and a challenge to the trade system, especially if we're talking about understanding of what EEZs are all about and what kind of powers and rights allow for states, coastal states to have. I think that is a very important question to ask. if most of the maritime strategy documents, assumptions about the global connectivity of transportation and trade is true, then I think it is important, even in Europe, to consider the extent to which claims in terms of EEZ in the South China Sea and the East China Sea will have an impact on the ability of transport at sea to proceed as we know it. And I'll show you in a moment in particular why that is particularly true and particularly troubling in the South China Sea. And as I said, I think the situation in East Asia presents a fundamental intellectual challenge to the way we conceptualize maritime strategy. I'm not saying that we have to adopt a different grammar, as it were, but we need to be aware that most of the time, when certain state actors are using the idea of maritime security in East Asia, they do not intend it as let's get together and prevent some boatmen to cross over the Mediterranean. That really is not the case. And the South China Sea, I think, is where things really get a little bit messy. So, speaking of messy things, the map doesn't really help. But just for the purpose of discussion, this is a close-up of the territories here in the disputed sort of the parcels in particular, where there's a number of islands that have been occupied over time by the various claimants to the disputes. I want to point out one in particular, if I can find it, which is, hang on, south, where the heck is it? Blimey. Fairy Cross Reef, the one over there, right? Which is the latest example of a number of dredging activities that have been pursued in the South China Sea. Now remember what I was saying about how important, how the East China Sea, it's very much a political theatre, where owning existing islands is about proving a capacity to govern in your own country, right? Whether you are President Xi Jinping in China or Prime Minister Abe, if you can say like, I am dealing with the Chinese, or I'm dealing with the Japanese, guys, don't worry, the islands are ours, right? And recently they even made a pop song about it. Have you seen the pop music thing about the Diaoyu Islands? It's an absolute blast. It even has like a group of dancers dressed, you know, black ops type of guys with pink flowers dancing behind the singer, and how, you know, and the whole song is all about how the Diaoyu are Chinese and you have to protect the Diaoyu Chinese if you're a patriot in China. Which is, honestly, it's funny on the one hand, but also very troubling on another level. So there is a political dimension. But remember also what I was saying, that the sea is used for a number of different activities, some of which are really pertaining to the ability to project power at sea, to control either the sea lanes of communication or to project power as a platform, right? Well, in South China Sea, the dispute over the territorial islands, in particular the Spratly and Paracels, is slightly less in terms of priority. It's not that it doesn't matter, but the political dimension is slightly less important than the strategic one. To the point that even when there aren't islands, they're making up islands. They're actually creating out of nowhere. This being one example. One of the many coral reefs that are being turned into actual islands. And you might ask, why? What's that reason? Well, it's very simple actually. This China Sea, it's big, but it's not very, very big. It's about 360 nautical miles at its widest point. And if you're in Taiwan, if you are in the Ryukyu Islands, or if you're in the coastal area of China, there is an element of ability to project power across it quite substantially. There is a land base. This China Sea is the 6th largest body of water in the world. And right in the middle, it's very difficult to operate on a standard operational tempo in terms of air power projection, unless you have lots of carriers, or better, something that you can't really sink, because after all, the carrier, you can sink it, right? So let's have some airstrips. Ha ha! Now what is that the Chinese are dredging and bringing together? They're creating islands with just actually 2 things. 3 airstrips, deep sea ports, and a couple of construction, because the poor chap that ends up, you know, being there, it's not an exotic really destination. You need to give them something, right? You need to give them a bed, a bit of a gym, that sort of thing. Well, there you go. Look at it, right? Fairy Cross Reef didn't exist 9 months ago. Now it does look like a proper airstrip with a proper port anchorage. And I underline the fact that the ones that really matter strategically and that allows to think in terms of projection of power are the ones where you can actually have the possibility to sustain operations on there. How do you sustain them? How do you move logistics, food, pieces to support sort of the technical use of the aircraft? Well, you need a deep sea port because you need a larger ship that will deploy the necessary facilities and materials there. And if you look at the picture over here, that's exactly what that looks like. A port deep enough to allow for logistical support to arrive and to have this not just being an island made up because you want to make a political statement, but also, more importantly, a strategic point d'appui, as it were, from where you can project air power over a radius to up to 400-500 kilometers, which allows you then, together with other islands and other dredging, if you look at the map of the islands that have been sort of dredged and transformed, they all have similar characteristics, and if you connect them together, they do represent a network that allows you for a much better projection of power. If you combine that with what I was saying about the East China Sea, and if you combine that with the fact that there is a strong suspicion that near or the prospect of a near the defense identification zone might actually happen in the future, I would say, if you were to ask me when this is going to happen, I'd say wait and see until the islands are actually finished. Because in the East China Sea, the difference is that politically it was very important. In the South China Sea, the strategic dimension is probably more important. So if and when it happens, well, I'd say a good indicator to get a sense of it is probably when part of the small artificial islands that are supposed to implement that will come about. But again, we are a few months off from that, and we shall see how things advance. So in terms of the practice, I think the strategic projection, as I said, in the East China Sea, definitely there is a political dimension that is extremely important, sensitivity in particular insofar as China and Japan is concerned. In the South China Sea, the element is a lot more about the strategic dimension, even though both factors still exist. The last quick point, what are the point of contact between Europe and East Asia? Sorry, I jumped there. I think at the moment there is an interesting element. In East Asia, of course, all the state actors are concerned about the global shipping, the global trade. China, Japan, Korea have been involved in the anti-piracy mission in the Gulf of Aden, and I'm happy to talk about that later. But I think the interesting developments in this respect are the NATO-Japan partnership, which has seen the Prime Minister Abe for the only Prime Minister of Japan to actually go twice to NATO to make a speech, and the sort of agreements that were signed in the first exercise, the picture of which you can see on the back, being conducted in September this year. Again, I think in the context of Europe, East Asia should bring about three different types of questions. One, about how East Asia fits into an evolving relationship with the United States. This goes back to the fact that the United States are pivoting, rebalancing to the Asia-Pacific region. What does that imply? What does that require in terms of the relationship with Europe, provided that Europe is not free of serious security challenges, whether it is North Africa, Middle East, or more recently, Russia and the Eastern European component. A question of strategic focus, perhaps. That's another important question. We cannot be anywhere, we cannot be everywhere. Perhaps one question to ask is, in redefining or in looking at how NATO is shaping a relationship with countries like Japan, Europe is reconsidering and reviewing the relationship with the United States. Perhaps a way to engage and find a solution to both aspects is by asking the question, what should be the strategic focus? Is there a geographic dimension that can contribute? And if so, are the Indian Ocean and the Arctic Ocean the main focus of that strategic attention? Both theatres being relatively close to Europe and certainly directly important to trade, commerce and future development. Or, in the very minimalist sort of dimension of it, Or maybe that should be a coordinating agenda, like an informal agreement, whether it is the EU, NATO and the United States, or EU and the United States, or NATO and the United States, a possibility to actually talk to each other and develop an agenda that, informally at least, takes on board these points to create a much greater synergy and sort of maximization of mutual and respective interests. But certainly there is a factor there that because of the nature of trade and global trade, and because of the growing importance of East Asia in a broader sense, we can't really stand by and wave at whatever happens as things unfold. And I will qualify this statement. I think if anyone wants to ask this question, from my mind, the EU statement on the air defense identification zone that came out last year is a classic example, especially if you compare it with the recent resolution by the US Congress on the same subject. I can read them out. I have them with me. I can show you why there is a substantial difference, and that difference matters. From my point of view, the statement that the EU put out was a tremendous political failure in that respect. I was in Japan and visiting East Asia. In the months afterwards, I was systematically told by pretty much everybody in the political and military sphere in Tokyo, in Seoul, in Taipei, what's going on in Europe. Why that all parties should restrain themselves. We are restrained, the Chinese aren't. Really? Seriously? So what are the conclusions of all this? I think from a maritime perspective, the EU and East Asia are standing at a crossroad. I'm not suggesting that there is a clear pathway, but certainly there is an important discussion to have about what are the priorities, are there any shared priorities, what are the principles. We can't just say and repeat all the time that we all want to support the international order as it is. We all support the freedom of navigation. And then, when push comes to shove, we kind of shy away from making coherent statements about it. We need to acknowledge the different grammars. I'm not saying that we have to join, or we have to force the others. There are problems we cannot solve. It might not be in our interest to solve, but in interacting with the other parties, we need to understand that there is a different way of understanding particular aspects of projection of power at sea and the use of the sea from a state perspective that are not exactly the same. And perhaps, if we do that, we'll have an opportunity to balance the lack of capabilities. After all, it's not that we can show up with a couple of carrier battle groups in the South China Sea and say like, okay guys, let's give it a moment of pause. That's not going to happen. That happens only in the West Wing and outside the West Wing in Washington DC, because you have at the end of the day 20 carrier battle groups, which includes both carriers and US Marine Corps power projection forces. I think one of the critical elements to find this rebalance between a policy sort of position, statements and capabilities is by identifying a clear focus. Is there a discussion to have with East Asia in general and some countries in particular as to whether we can join forces? Is the Indian Ocean one of these places? Is the Arctic one of these places? Is there a space for us in the South China Sea? Is there a space for the East Asians in the Mediterranean? Some would say that the East Asians are already in the Mediterranean. Look at when, Chinese people were taken out 4 months ago from Libya. It was a Greek corvette that did it, not a Chinese one. So there is an element there to ask this question about the geographic focus. And I think also in line with what is already in the maritime strategy, certainly at the EU level, I think there is, within this context, in asking this question, there is a very important opportunity to actually come at the end of it with an increased synergic sort of attitude and uses of the current partnerships based less on an ambiguous acceptance of each other and a lot more on a conscious choice that we can't be everywhere all the time, but there are principles that we all share and we are willing and able to act upon them within our capabilities. Thank you very much.